want to welcome y'all. We've got a number of visitors this morning. We're so glad that you all are here also to join in our Bible study with us. We're studying from the book of Hebrews, and we're using a book that our brother Donnie Rader put together as an assist in that study. And we're in lesson 5, Hebrews chapter 5. And just to give a quick summary of where we are up to this point, if you notice that the book again was broken into two different halves. Part 1 being Christ is the way, and that takes us through the 10th chapter, and then part 2, don't give up, and that takes us through the rest of the book. We've taken a look at the superiority of Christ's person, and as the first part through chapter 4. In verse 13, and then we got into the superiority of Christ's work, chapter 4 through chapter 10. And specifically, as we looked at that work, we're looking at the superiority of Christ's priesthood today. The first part of that, and as we go in and finish up chapter 4 and get into chapter 5, and then we take a slight detour to bring in another warning. The third of 5 warnings comes in towards the end of chapter 5, and then the rest of that will be in chapter 6 as we get into it. And then you can see that we still have a number of different comparisons of the superiority of Christ to go as we go through that. So if you want to open up your Bibles or you look up here on the screen, we'll be reading through Hebrews chapter 5, and we'll go ahead and start in the middle today. Todd, with you, Bonnie, and all the way back. And if you don't want to read, just poke the person next to you, and then keep poking until you get the next reader. So there we go. And then Ray will after we get down in the back there, we'll come back up to you and to finish it up. 2 verses each, please. And this is all of the references today will be from the New King James Version. Although you can read from whatever version you happen to have right there, and that'll be just fine. So, Todd, if you would get us started.
For every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself also is beset with weakness.
And because of it, he is obligated to offer sacrifices for sins, as for the people, so also for himself. And no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was.
So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." He also says in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek."
Who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered.
And being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him, called of God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek.
Of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the workings of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food.
For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason use their senses exercised to discern both good and evil.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. So as we look at chapter 5, we notice that there's a split here in this first section when we're talking about Christ as the high priest. And so we're going to look at 2 different things. We're going to be looking at the qualifications and functions of the high priest in the first 4 verses, and then we're going to be looking at how Christ qualifies as the perfect high priest. So as we look at the beginning of chapter 5, we've got we've been taking a look at these transitional words that have been bringing us and connecting chapter to chapter. And so we have another one of these, but it's a different one, the word for. And the word for is just kind of a continuation word, all right? So before we had therefore, and you had a result, and so you had one thing which then resulted in something else. Now we have this continuation of a thought that began back in the end of chapter 4, and we talked about that as we started into this idea of the perfect high priest. And so this continuation word now is used here. And so we're looking for a resulting thought that comes from this. Or you could look at the word for as the word because. You could say because in that, and sometimes that helps to understand. So what we have is we have a blending of two ideas here. We have this idea that, as we looked in the end of chapter 4, this idea that we have the best high priest ever. Okay? And then we looked at a number of things that make that statement true. Okay, we looked at the idea that he passed through heaven, that he was the Son of God, that he can sympathize with our weaknesses, that he was tempted in everything but without sin. And we could draw near to God with confidence and find grace and get help in the time of need. All those things are true. And so as a result of that, okay, now we get into chapter 5, and those things are true, and then we look at the idea of because. Why is that, okay? Why is that? And so then we get that then introduces us then to what we're going to be starting with here in chapter 5. This idea that there are human priests which have a number of qualifications that are out there, but because they're human, they're limited in comparison to Jesus, and that's why the word so or also and also is used at the beginning of verse 5 there, because you have the idea that Christ met all of those qualifications as a priest, but he surpassed those human priests because of their limitations and because of the great qualifications the things that go even beyond what those qualifications are. So that's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be taking a look at all of those things and that great blending of the two ideas in here to get the comparison. So as we look at question 1 from your book, why does the writer need to address the qualifications of a high priest? Why do we even have to talk about this? Why is it important? Who are they writing to? Who's the Hebrew writer writing to? Say that again? Shalom back there. Who somebody said? Okay, so Christians of Jewish background, right? And so, yeah, and so, what was the problem that they were having?
No, the reason we're doing this is to show the difference between Christ and the other priest.
Okay. Yes, that there are some differences, but there's a certain concept that is getting in the way of them understanding this. And if you had to name the biggest problem that the Jews had in understanding about the kingdom of God that Jesus was talking about, what would have been the biggest problem that they had? Jeff, do you?
Well, they were looking at the Levitical priesthood.
Say that one more time.
They were looking at the Levitical priesthood.
The Levitical priesthood, correct, which was a spiritual or a physical priesthood? Physical, okay? So this idea, this is the problem that they're having here. The Jews are having trouble understanding this idea that this is not a physical kingdom that we're talking about. It's a spiritual kingdom. And the writer's going to have to move them into this understanding. And this one right here, the idea that there could be a joint king and a joint high priest, from a physical standpoint, that's just not possible, okay? So this, you can see why there would be some confusion here. The Jews were looking for their Messiah or their Christ, and that whole idea of the Messiah and the Christ, they were looking for something associated with the king of that. When they thought of Messiah, they're thinking king. When they're thinking and Christ is just the Greek word for Messiah, the Hebrew word. Okay, they both mean the anointed one. Okay, so you have this idea that it's got to be, and who was it they always talked about? They always talked about the lineage of David, because that, in fact, was the physical lineage that the Messiah was going to come through. And so here's the king of the lineage of David, going to sit on the physical throne, going to be the king, all of this and everything. And so, oh, wow, that's great. All right, looking forward to it. But in the physical kingdom, that the Messiah was going to be sitting on the physical throne of Jerusalem, where were the priests for that kingdom going to come from? What did the Mosaic Law say?
Levi.
The tribe of Levi. Oh, man. Well, this Jesus, where's he from? He's from the tribe of Judah. Why has no priest ever come from Judah? This is crazy. What are you talking about? It's like the lesson this morning that Jesse was given on Nicodemus in the book of John on the radio today. Well, you have to be born again. What, can you come out of your mom's womb twice? You know, it just doesn't make any sense. And so you have this issue right here. Now, the prophetic king, the Messiah and the Christ we were talking about, came from the tribe of Judah. And so the physical lineage, and this could cause some confusion, the physical lineage of the Messiah was going to be through the tribe of Judah. Okay? The physical lineage was going to be there through that tribe. But that's the physical lineage, all right? So when you compare the physical information on the Messiah to the prophecy on the Messiah, all of a sudden you get introduced to this character named Melchizedek. And what do we find in there? We find that the comparison for the Messiah and the Christ is to Melchizedek, not David. Okay, so we're going to spend some time talking about Melchizedek because it's a very different thing. And the Jews, again, were having a problem with this. Melchizedek was this eternal, he had the word eternal associated with him. And what are we talking about when we're talking about eternal? If I say eternal to you, what goes through your mind? Something physical or something spiritual? Right. Hint, hint, Jews. We're going to be talking about Melchizedek, and we're going to be talking about him as being the eternal king, as being the eternal high priest, and all those kinds of things, which we'll get into in questions 3 and 5, but it's going to be a spiritual reference. Oh, that blew their minds. Okay, so this is the head scratcher we're going to have to work out here, and we're going to do that in chapter 5 today. So, okay, so, excuse me, as we get started, what are the 5 qualifications or functions given in verses 1 through 4 in chapter 5 that are the functions or qualifications of all priests? Okay, so let's get started, Shirley, with you. What's the first one? Starting at verse 1. We'll take them in order because the Bible takes them in order.
Man.
Okay, from men. Now, what does it mean when you're from men? Okay, it means that you can understand. If you're a man, right, guys and gals, you always say this. Oh, you're not a woman, so you can't understand what I'm talking about, or you know. Well, there's some truth to that, you know. But when you are, in this particular case, the high priest is a person, a human being, with all the same frailties that anybody else has. The understanding comes along with that sometimes. All right, so what's the second thing? Okay, from among men, what's functions for man? Okay. Functions for God, functions for man. Which is the emphasis on for the work that the high priest is, or the priest is doing?
Offer gifts and sacrifices.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
offers gifts and sacrifices.
Okay. Who is the priest offering those sacrifices for?
For God, on behalf of man.
Oh, that was sneaky the way you did that. For God. Unto God, for, or in the name of the person that brought the sacrifice, right? So it's for man to God, right? Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so the work is benefiting people, all right? What's the third one?
Offer gifts and sacrifice.
Gifts and sacrifices. Okay, so we're talking about offerings here. They come in different sizes and different types. The gifts were those bloodless offerings, and we saw that there are a number of those. And then the sacrifices were the blood offerings, where you're actually sacrificing something. Not a sacrifice you're making, but you're sacrificing something. Okay, so what's the next one? Qualification. Ken?
The priests were acquainted with man's weaknesses because they were weak.
Okay. All right. So you've got this. There's the weaknesses are associated with. If you've got a weakness and I understand it, and I empathize with you, and I help you and work with you, I'm showing compassion towards you. So we're talking about the priest having compassion because he's human too. That we're making. Notice that the priest has all those same problems that you have, and so again, you've got the idea of making sacrifices not only for himself because he's a sinner, but for you also. And so all of those things are attached. There's one more, number 5, in verse 4. Okay, appointed by God. All right, and so we have the idea of the honor of the office. The honor comes from not you giving the honor to yourself. I accept, this award, No, it's you being given this office, and as a result, the honor comes from the giver. And the giver is who? God. God is the one that's doing the appointment. That's right. All right, so we have the 5 qualifications. Now, these are the standard for the priests. Now we're going to compare them to Christ as we look at this, okay? So question 3, and we saw earlier that in verses 5 and 6, both of these quotes come from different Psalms. Psalms 2 and 7 for the Son, and then Psalm 110 verse 4 for the priest. So what does the fact that he is God's Son and that he was raised from the dead, what does that have to do with the priesthood? And you can see why the Jews would ask this question. They're not supposed to be associated with each other, okay? Anything having to do with lineage and all of that kind of stuff associated with the king side of this, that's Judah. Got nothing to do with the Levitical priesthood. So what does this have to do with anything?
The nose of the lineage of Aaron.
Okay. Who's better than Todd?
He quotes that first verse way back in chapter 1 and verse 5. Okay. It was like the first argument that he had made. Mm-hmm. And so he's building on that. So he's already established that Christ is the Son of God. That makes him superior. Now he's going to say, well, the same God who said that he was a son also said that he was a priest.
And what would that tell you then? What conclusion would you make by that?
That the Messiah would be a priest.
That both those things are true, right? Yeah. So it was said by the same person, same God, right? Okay, so yeah, you notice that both of those were said by God the Father. That he's my son, I've begotten you, and then the part about the priest forever. So let's take a look at this first part that Todd was talking about. The one from Psalms chapter 2. You are my son, today I have begotten you. What is this pointing to? The resurrection. It's the begotten part that is pointing towards this resurrection. And we know that because if you look in Acts chapter 13 and verse 33, you have Paul on his first missionary journey out there. He's at Antioch and Pisidium. He's doing his sermon out there. And he quotes, he does this quote, throws Psalms 2 and 7 in there. And it says, God, in his sermon, Paul said, God has fulfilled this for us, their children, and that he has raised up Jesus. As it is also written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Okay, so this idea of the begotten you is tied to the idea of resurrection. Well, how's it tied that way? Well, you see Paul again, Colossians 1 and verse 18, he pulls it all together when he says he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn of the dead. And this is where we see this idea of the firstborn of the dead and the impact of that in everything he might be preeminent. And so the idea of the top, the sovereign, the preeminence, the firstborn of the dead comes from this idea of I have begotten you. You have been born from me, you know. That's all of that is tied together in this idea. So you see how the first part is tied to the resurrection, it's tied to the preeminence, sovereignty, the kingship, all that is tied into this first statement. The second statement is that God made is about this idea of the priest, and we're talking about Melchizedek there. And you can see that, again, as Todd was saying, that you have this idea of the appointment of this office is by God. The same one that said, you're my son, that I've begotten you, is also the one that says you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And so now we have the idea of both of these offices being held by one person. Is that possible in the physical Israel? No, it's not. So it cannot be a physical thing we're talking about. It has to be a spiritual thing. And of course, the idea, as we talk about Melchizedek, now we'll get, how that picture comes up. Does that make sense? Everybody with us so far? Okay. Now here's a bonus question. When did Jesus begin his reign as king and high priest? Knowing all that you know up till now. When did he begin his reign as king and high priest? That person who is anointed and given to this position, holding both of them at the same time. When he was raised from the dead. And specifically, seated where? At the right hand of God. So here we have this idea now, the concept of the right hand and what that means is associated with here. And back in Hebrews 1 and verse 13, we're introduced to the concept when it said, but to which of the angels said he at any time, sit on my right hand? Remember we talked about better than the angels. Why? Because he was offered to sit at the right hand of the Father. And so this idea of right hand gets back to the idea of preeminence, sovereignty, all of that. Here is the person that is running the show for me. Okay, this is my right-hand man. And you see the concept is used many times. We quote it here in Mark, Colossians, 1, 2, 3, 4 more times in the book of Hebrews, a total of 5 times. And so we see that Jesus' reign as king and high priest began when he was resurrected, begotten of the Father, and seated at the right hand of God. And all those pieces are pulled together. Todd, go ahead. Yes, it is.
Psalm that he calls him, talks about him sitting at his right hand as king, talks about his scepter in verse 2, and ruling in the midst of his enemies. So he's king. And then he says, you're a priest.
Isn't that a beautiful picture that's put there? And Paul, the writer here put it together and just Two verses. Two verses he managed to pull together many different concepts. You might think it was inspired by a divine being, and you would be right. All right, question 4. How do we know that Psalm 2 and verse 7 is talking about the resurrection of Christ? This is a review. How do we know? Where can we go to prove that? We just talked about it. What scripture would you run to help prove this concept? Acts 13. That's right. Acts 13:33. Beautiful place to go to for that. So we have that. It talks plainly about Jesus' resurrection there. The concept of the firstborn of the dead, which is a really cool concept that we're going to get more and more into as we go along. We don't have time for that today. That'll be some other study. So, question 5. What does it mean that Christ is priest according to the order of Melchizedek? Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the characteristics of Melchizedek. Do you remember the Melchizedek story? Where do we find that? I hear it out there. Genesis something, that's right. Genesis 14, verses 18 through 20. The story of Abram and Melchizedek, king of Salem and high priest of the Most High God. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these things that Melchizedek has in there. He was a king and a high priest at the same time.
Office through descent.
Aha, okay. It means a couple of things. Without father and mother, not only it means no physical lineage to look at, but if there is no physical lineage, then it also brings out the concept of eternity. Remember we talked earlier about the eternal king and the eternal high priest. We were going to get into that in these questions. That's what we're talking about. That is the type. When you have no lineage, then that means you're eternal. Okay? You are in the office. The Bible describes you, and you're now eternal as far as that's concerned in a physical sense or in a spiritual sense. Okay, so you have that. No beginning, no end, Alpha and Omega. Then appointed by God, we talked about that. And notice the idea of the preeminence. And notice the examples that were given that God provided for us to help us to understand this. It's very simple. Melchizedek blessed Abram, and Abram gave tithes to Melchizedek. So the discussion is going to be, who is the more preeminent of the two? The one who receives the blessing or the one who gives the blessing? The one who receives the tithes or the one who gives the tithes?
He was a priest.
Right. So you can see Melchizedek is the preeminent one because he's the one that gave the blessing and he's the one that received the tithes, even from Father Abram, the father of the Jews. This is the one that's put up there on the pedestal, right? Okay, so all of that establishes the idea of the preeminence that's there, okay? So all of these factors are about Melchizedek. Jesus had all of these factors as part of his qualifications. So, and you can see how these qualifications are going to be way above the human qualification. He meets all the human qualifications and then surpasses them in these many ways. So again, you can see now the direct comparison of the two. Okay, question 6. Todd, did you have a question before you? Okay, go ahead.
On page 41 was interesting,
Yes.
right? Were you going to get to that?
No, but go ahead.
You got Melchizedek, who's the king of Salem, and you got the king of Sodom there with him. These are, you might say, Gentiles, although they haven't established the Jewish nation yet because it's going to come from Abraham. And so he's priest of God Most High for everyone. If you wanted to offer a gift to God Most High, you could go through him. But when the Levitical priesthood comes, it's just this one family that has priests for their own family. So for Jesus to be of Melchizedek's order is a much greater priesthood over the whole world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it was also the only way that all the nations of the earth should be blessed. It's the only way.
Right. So here's this little known guy that's out there. Now here we're going to get into Psalm. This next question gets to Todd's point, and that is what is the point being made from Psalm 110 about Melchizedek? The Psalm 110 one was, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." What does forever mean? You say, "Oh, come on, Norm, forever, forever." Well, that's what forever means, is forever. What does forever mean? It's a good English word. Ken?
Like until time is no more.
Oh, that's like a song line. You hear somebody in a mushy song singing about forever and, till time is no more, I will love you. Yeah, this is, forever is about time, okay? And we have the time here. And so, yeah, as long as time lasts. So here's a bonus question for you. How long will time last?
Until the end of time.
For us, it's till we die. So there are one of two things that are going to happen to all of us. We are going to live until we die, and then we will die. Or, what's the other thing that might happen? Or Christ would come again before we die, and like in the days of Noah, that was the end of it. At that point, they thought they would be living forever, and blah, 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 and all of a sudden for them, it was all over. And that is the end of time. There will be no time after that. All we're waiting for at that point is eternity is starting. And so on it goes from there. So, yeah, so we have the second coming of Christ. So it gives us the idea of a priest forever is tied to those two concepts. All right, so question 7. What point is being made about the prayers, the cries, the tears in the days of his flesh? Here's the scripture right here, okay, and we're talking about this first part. Who in the days of his flesh, what are we talking about in the days of his flesh? It's a little cryptic, right? There's a little meat of the word part here. It's not that hard, though, if you think about it. In the days of his flesh. What's that?
He was on earth among the people.
Okay, so his human life, right? When Jesus was a man living on earth in the days of his flesh. Okay, so then we have the second part. When he had offered up prayers and supplications and vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. What comes to your mind? What scene comes to your mind from the New Testament?
Garden.
The Garden of Gethsemane. Yeah, that's the first thing that comes to my mind too. And so if you picture the Garden of Gethsemane, you won't have any problems understanding this verse right here and what that means. So then we get to question 8. What does he was heard because of his godly fear mean? So now we're looking at this last part of the verse, and he was heard because of his godly fear. First of all, before we answer that question, here's a bonus question. Who does God hear? And what I mean by hearing is the biblical hearing, which is responding to. You hear, you understand, and to make a decision in your mind, you respond to it. Okay, who does God hear?
He heard his prayer, but he also, he wanted to cut the fast from him, but he said, "As thy will be done," and it wasn't.
Okay, so you went right to this this particular thing that we're talking about here, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the prayer which Jesus was praying to his Father. And that the Hebrew writer, I think that's what he's talking about, is this idea of godly fear. Well, so what is godly fear? What's another word for godly fear? Anybody have different? New American Standard uses the word piety. What does piety mean? Throw a pie. What's that? Righteousness, okay. So we're talking about it's something that you do towards somebody. Okay, you have piety towards your character. In this particular case, he was heard because of his godly fear toward who? Toward God. Okay, so how did he feel about God? That feeling and that understanding came out in godly fear, in him acting pious, in him reverencing God. Okay, so it's this idea of reverence and caution, dread. All of these things are tied into that. Okay, and so godly fear would be a good way to figure out who does God hear or respond to. Somebody with godly fear. A couple of other ones, and there are others, but those who ask according to God's will, 1 John 5, verses 14 and 15, we know that we have what we ask for. So that's, if we ask according to God's will, that's one. Those who love God, those who keep his commandments, John 14, verses 13 through 15. Also, those who love God are people that God hears. Okay, so we're talking about not just being aware of, God knows everything that goes on with everybody. He can read our hearts. But we're talking about who does God respond to? Who does he choose to respond to? Okay? Yeah, and that's what falls into all these. Okay, so that is the section that for right now wraps up. We're going to take a little break from the high priest part, and we're going to slip in warning number 3, and that's what's next. And so in we come with this an introduction, basically at the end of this chapter, to warning 3, which is that there is danger in not maturing. And so we're going to talk about the problems of dull of hearing, and also in need of the first principle teaching. So what are the warnings we looked at so far? Very quickly, we had warning 1, which was to pay attention to what you heard, because you could drift away from God. You can't escape the consequences. Then into warning 2, the first part was don't harden your heart, because you could leave God through unbelief, and thus you need to fear that you'll fall short of God's rest, and then don't fail like Israel did. Okay, so those are the first 2 warnings. So now we're introduced to the first part of warning 3. The second part, to finish up warning 3, is going to be all of chapter 6 next week. So come back for part 2. But the first part is there is danger in not maturing. So let's go on to question 9. In what sense were the Hebrews dull of hearing? And before you answer that, a bonus question. What is the number 1 mission of a Christian? What is a Christian's reason for existence?
Grace.
Grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ, so that you can do what? So that you can go to heaven, and you better do this before, or you're not going to heaven. Teach others, otherwise you're useless. You're a fruit that you're a tree that's bearing no fruit. Bear fruit. So yeah, so teaching the Gospels to others is the number 1 mission. Okay, so that's what our mission is. All right, so now another bonus question. What obvious problem did these brethren have? And I say obvious because he talks about it right away. If this is the mission, what's the problem with these guys?
to God, for one thing. They were dull of hearing and they didn't do what they should have done.
The dull of hearing was the expression used to describe the actions. Somebody who's dull of hearing is like if Ray turned off the hearing aids, right? And everybody in the back, Rhoda's back there, she flips it off to their reaction to the class at that point is going to be silence, right? Because silence is all they're hearing. Okay? So what's the issue here? What's the obvious problem that these people have? Mission 1 was, I want you to be teachers. They're not mature because, and we know they're not mature because they're not doing what? What? They're not studying, obviously, and as a result of not studying, what are they not doing? What's that? They're not, back to not hearing again. They're not teaching. By this time, they should have been teachers. They're not only not teaching, they're the ones that have to be taught. They're in the situation of the people they should be teaching.
The difference between being on milk and meat is understanding the difference between good and evil. The insinuation is that they did nothing as well.
Exactly. Yes. They weren't teachers. They're needing to be taught. So that's a problem. So we understand all of that. So now back to the question, dull of hearing, in what sense? What were a couple of things that these people, that made them act as if they were dull of hearing?
Evil heart, and they departed from God.
Okay. That was the result. Yep, that was the result, and that's why the warning. Exactly, that's the warning. But look, it was a lack. They lacked an understanding or a knowledge of God's word. Why? Why did they lack that? They were unable to discern between good and evil. Why?
Obviously a lot of verses in the Bible, but one thing that I just keep coming to is 1 John 4:4. Stronger is he that is in you than he that is in the world. So say that all the time. Remind yourself, especially when you're driving, and just focus.
The incentive. So the incentive to study and know and understand. Very simply, in human terms, literally, they had not trained their conscience to be able to react in a godly way, to understand the difference between good and evil, to make good decisions, because they just didn't practice. Not practice, didn't study. If they did study, they didn't use it in their own life. It just walk through life with just blinders on, dull of hearing. So there he goes. The last question was what created the lack of maturity, and it was this inexperience is what we're talking about here. They were only partaking of the milk of the word, and let's face it, they were doing the easy things because they were easy. The minimum daily requirements for a Christian. And as a result, they were skinny, weak, dull people as they went through. And they had to be retaught. So, all right, so there we go, and there's your summary. And next week, chapter 6, part 2 of the warning. And then we'll get back to the high priest again. Thank you, guys.